Over the past year or so, I've talked quite a bit about the future of Amtrak, going into detail about new locomotives, train sets, and cars. One big theme throughout all these videos is that the completion of many of these projects seems to converge in 2022 and 2023, and obviously it's 2022 right now, so is right now the future of Amtrak that I've been talking about so much? Let's find out today on American High Speed Rail Week 2. Since the 2010s, Amtrak has been working quite a bit to improve its infamously old trains, some of which date back to the mid-1970s. Since recently, Amtrak has been receiving more funding than it has in the past, there's been an influx of equipment orders, service expansion plans, and other infrastructure projects, all of which are very interesting to rail fans and travelers alike. This video will be split into a few parts, all of which will focus on specific projects that Amtrak is working on to improve its trains and services over the next few years. So with that said, let's get right into it. Chapter 1. Acela 2 High-Speed Trains. Perhaps the most exciting project Amtrak has been undertaking lately is the replacement of their current Acela trains, which operate on their most profitable route, the Acela Express. The Acela Express started operating on the electrified Northeast Corridor between Boston and Washington, D.C. in the year 2000, using Alstom/Bombardier Acela train sets. Acela was America's first high-speed rail, reaching a top speed of 150 miles per hour for a stretch of the northern portion of its route in New England. When the Acela was introduced at the turn of the century, it quickly became a household name, as high-speed rail was a futuristic concept at the time, the likes of which the US had never seen before. It also became Amtrak's most profitable route, as I said before, being able to charge more for tickets with faster travel times, newer trains, and better service for passengers on board. Since 2000, the original Acela trains have been pretty reliable, braving cold winters and humid summers in the Northeast, but as the years have gone on, these original Acela trains have been starting to look more and more outdated, and as a premium service, passengers demand modern trains. In the mid-2010s, Amtrak knew this was beginning to happen, so they started their search for a replacement for the aging Acela train sets. As was the case with the original Acelas, Amtrak turned to Europe's high-speed rail expertise for inspiration for their new trains. Amtrak was inspired by France's Alstom Avelia Euroduplex trains seen on the TGV, which were manufactured by the same company as the original Acelas, so in late 2016, Amtrak received a $2.4 billion loan from the federal government to order a fleet of new high-speed trains built by Alstom. These trains were to be built on Alstom's next-generation Avelia platform, which was a global platform in which similar trains were ordered by SNCF later on. Soon enough, Alstom and Amtrak released a video teasing this new train, which was to be named the Avelia Liberty. This animated video shows mock-ups of these Liberty train sets operating on a modernized Northeast Corridor, providing high-speed service with modern-era train sets. To replace the first-gen Acelas, Amtrak ordered 28 Avelia Liberties or Acela 2s, which were not only bigger, consisting of 9 cars instead of 6, but also faster, being able to hit a theoretical top speed of 220 miles per hour instead of 165 as seen on the original Acelas. Of course, in service, these trains would only be able to do 150 miles per hour as the current Acelas do, but Amtrak planned for future services to be able to go much faster with necessary track improvements. Anyways, the first of these 28 train sets began production about a year later in late 2017 at Alstom's facilities in upstate New York. As production continued, Amtrak's mock-up art became more accurate, with the paint scheme being changed from the original blue and red paint scheme to a cleaner blue and white paint scheme. By 2020, the first train sets were completed, with the first train being released from Alstom in February being sent to Pueblo, Colorado to be tested by the Federal Railroad Administration for 9 months. The next month, train set 2 was released from Alstom's plant, this time heading east to Philadelphia where testing would begin on the Northeast Corridor. Both of these trains were completely unfurnished, being filled with computers for crews to monitor the train systems, and at this point, trains were expected to enter service in 2021, with the full fleet of original Acelas being retired by late 2022. Unfortunately, as testing continued, the new trains were found to have quite a few issues, specifically pertaining to their pantographs, which would bounce on and off the overhead wire at high speeds, causing the train to lose power. By 2021, testing continued on the Northeast Corridor, with modifications being done to the pantographs to mitigate the issues. Later in the year, train set 1 was returned from Colorado and it began to be furnished at Alstom's factory in New York. A few months later, in November of 2021, train set 3 made its way east from New York, being the first fully furnished Acela 2 train set. It soon joined train set 2 in Philadelphia, where testing continues to this day. 2021, the year when the Acela 2s were supposed to enter service, has come and gone, and now in 2022, none of these trains are operating in revenue service. Unfortunately, a laundry list of hardware issues and production issues have all come together to delay this project quite a bit. Nowadays, information on what's going on is quite scarce, but for now, the plan is for these trains to enter service in 2023, with the full replacement and retirement of the original Acelas coming in 2025. Amtrak's next plans for these trains are to begin qualification runs in the final months of 2022, and by early to mid 2023, the first 4 Acela 2s will hopefully enter revenue service. Until then, all we can do is hope for the best and enjoy the old Acelas while we still have them. As to what will happen with the OG Acelas after they're retired, we still don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if a power car, or maybe even a whole train, would be donated to a museum. Luckily, there is some better news. Despite all the setbacks due to hardware issues, the Acela 2 train sets continue to be built, and now that the first fully furnished train has been delivered to Amtrak, we have concrete proof that this project is moving along, just at a pretty slow pace. Anyways, as I said, we can only really hope for the best with the new Acelas, but when they enter service, they'll definitely be some of the world's most technologically advanced modern trains. Chapter 2: New Long-Distance Locomotives. Since the early 90s, General Electric Genesis series locomotives have formed the backbone of Amtrak's fleet, with over 250 locomotives in service across the country. Since they were introduced in the 90s, these locomotives have proven reliable, but as some start to turn 25 and even 30 years old, their shortcomings become more and more obvious. For one, Genesis locomotives, along with all other GE locomotives from the 90s, are prone to turbo oil seal failure, which causes hot oil to get into the exhaust, often causing fires. Additionally, Genesis locomotives were built in the 1990s, which was right before diesel emissions regulations took effect in the United States. Since then, climate change has become a much more pressing issue, so the EPA has created strict regulations which initially took effect in 1996, right after most of Amtrak's Genesis locomotives were built. Over the years, the regulations have gotten more and more stringent, and nowadays all new locomotives have to adhere to Tier 4 emissions standards, which are the EPA's strictest, reducing particulate matter and nitrous oxides by 90% from Tier 0 standards. Anyways, in the interest of having modern, reliable, and most importantly, environmentally friendly locomotives, Amtrak began to search for a replacement for their aging GEs. Following the success of Amtrak's new ACS-64 and SC-44 locomotives throughout the 2010s, Amtrak turned to Siemens once again for another locomotive design, this time for a long-distance diesel. In December of 2018, an agreement was reached between Amtrak and Siemens Mobility for 75 new long-distance locomotives using the proven Siemens Charger platform. This new locomotive would be similar to the existing SC-44 Chargers used on state-supported routes, while being slightly more ideal for long-distance service. These new long-distance Chargers would have larger fuel tanks, extra comfortable cabs, modern computer systems, and 200 less horsepower, reducing stress on the prime mover and allowing for longer service intervals. Naturally, when this order was announced, concept art was also released, and as many expected, the new Charger locomotives looked identical to the short-distance ones already operated by Amtrak, just in a Phase 5 paint scheme. Anyways, this order called for the first locomotive to enter service in 2021, so Siemens got to work designing the locomotive as soon as possible. After 2 years of Amtrak and Siemens working together to design the optimal locomotive for their long-distance services, more details were revealed, and it turned out these locomotives were going to be quite different from the renderings from 2018. Once again, renderings were released, but this time around, the locomotive looked much more unique. Obviously, as you can tell, the front end is completely different, using a removable nose cone instead of the notched nose design seen on the SC-44 Chargers. Additionally, the paint scheme was something completely different from the 2018 rendering, featuring a much more modern and colorful design. Finally, the official classification of these locomotives was revealed to be ALC-42, or Amtrak Long Distance Charger 42, meaning 4200 horsepower. Once again, Siemens and Amtrak went quiet on the Long Distance Charger project until June 11, 2021, when the first ALC-42, number 300, was released from the Siemens Mobility factory in Florin, California. After traveling across the country to Washington, D.C., 300 was moved to Delaware to begin the early phases of testing. Also around this time, Amtrak revealed that the ALC-42s will be painted in more than one paint scheme. 300 was said to be painted in a new Phase 6 paint scheme, which surprisingly would not be the main paint scheme seen on these locomotives, but rather just a placeholder scheme, as the main paint scheme wasn't ready in time for the first locomotives. Anyways, 8 ALC-42s would wear Phase 6, those being 300 and 302 through 308. Now you may be wondering, why'd I skip 301? Well, good thing you asked, because 301 may possibly be the most interesting ALC-42 of all, as this one was released from Siemens wearing a black coat of Amtrak paint, paying homage to Amtrak 4316, an ex-Penn Central E8 hastily painted into a contrived Amtrak paint scheme for Amtrak's first day of service in 1971. This commemorative unit for Amtrak's 50th anniversary was dubbed the Day 1 unit, and it was delivered just over a month after 300. Finally, locomotives 309 through 374 were to wear Phase 7, a slightly less complicated version of Phase 6, which will most likely become Amtrak's standard paint scheme across their system in the future. So back to the actual locomotives. Throughout 2021, ALC-42s tested a little bit in the Northeast, but other than that they just sat around receiving software tweaks. By the end of 2021, the first 4 locomotives have been delivered, and soon enough, Amtrak would begin the process of putting the ALC-42s into service. In January of 2022, Amtrak began to move the ALC-42s to various crew bases around the country, and soon enough, crews were being trained on these brand new locomotives. Finally, on February 8th, 2022, ALC-42s number 301 and 302 were put on the westbound Amtrak Empire Builder, and after 4 years of hard work, the ALC-42s entered service without any issues. Nah, just kidding. Right before departing Chicago's Union Station, 301 suffered a PTC failure, calling for a P42 to be put in front of the 2 chargers. Unfortunately, the ALC-42's first time in service wasn't as triumphant as planned, but to Siemens' credit, the PTC failure was not their fault, as the onboard PTC systems are made by Wabtec, not Siemens. Despite a slightly rocky debut, the ALC-42s successfully pulled the train from Chicago to Spokane, Washington, and in Spokane, 301 trailed behind a P42 to Portland, Oregon, while 302 got to lead the Seattle section of the train. Additionally, back in Chicago, Amtrak had announced that they added 50 new locomotives to this order, making for a total of 125 ALC-42s to be delivered between 2021 and 2027. So that leaves us in the present day. As of when this video is being put out, ALC-42s are in the beginning stages of their introduction to long-distance service. The first 2 routes to receive chargers were the Empire Builder and the City of New Orleans, but after those routes, in mid-2022, ALC-42s will be deployed in Washington, D.C. After Washington receives chargers, they'll be deployed on all other northeastern diesel-based routes by late 2022, and finally, in 2023, all other long-distance routes will gradually receive their own ALC-42s. Luckily, this project hasn't been delayed like projects such as the Acela 2s, so if all goes according to plan, over the next 2 or 3 years, Amtrak long-distance trains will begin to look a lot more modern, and ALC-42s will replace Genesis locomotives as the backbone of Amtrak's fleet, providing more reliable service while creating 1/10 the emissions. Chapter 3. Siemens Venture Cars. The last 2 projects I talked about are fine and dandy, but the new diesel locomotives don't really do a whole lot for passengers, short of increased reliability, and the Acela 2s obviously improve passenger experience, but only for those traveling between Boston and Washington, D.C. Luckily, for those outside of the Northeast, there's one project that'll improve equipment on over half of Amtrak's routes, and this project is called the Siemens Venture Project. The story begins in 2012 when a consortium of states composed of California, Illinois, Michigan, and Missouri announced a $352 million order for a fleet of 130 so-called next-generation bi-level passenger cars built by Nippon Sharyo. These new cars were to be an improved version of the existing bi-level California cars and surfliners, replacing Horizon cars and Comet cars in California and the Midwest with modern bi-level coaches. The first of these cars were supposed to be delivered between 2015 and 2018, with 88 cars going to the Midwest and 42 going to California. Unfortunately, as the design phase of these cars went on, it seemed like no progress was being made. 2015, the year when the first cars were planned to be delivered, came and went, and by May of that same year, Nippon Sharyo announced that they were 14 months behind in the production of these cars. With this unfortunate news, the project continued, but a few months later in August, it all came crashing down when a prototype car failed key safety tests. With this, Nippon Sharyo announced that these cars would have to be completely redesigned, delaying the project another 2 years further. With this news, the contract was terminated, leaving the states to search for a new manufacturer of these cars. Luckily, in November of 2017, the state consortium announced that they had indeed found a new manufacturer of these cars, and the design would be completely different from that of Nippon Sharyo's. Instead of using bi-level cars similar to those used on Amtrak California services, they would instead be ordering a fleet of 137 single-level cars manufactured by Siemens Mobility. These new cars were to be based on the existing Siemens Venture cars used on Brightline, but with slightly less luxury-oriented interiors. Of the 137 cars ordered, 49 would go to California for use on the San Joaquins, and 88 would go to Chicago, being used on basically every Amtrak Midwest train. For these two specific regions, there would be slightly different formats of these cars too, with California getting 7 semi-permanently coupled sets of 7 cars each, with 4 economy seating cars, 2 economy seating cars with vending machines, and 1 cab car with economy seating, which will use the same front-end design as the Siemens Charger locomotives which operate on this route. In the Midwest, trains would vary in length, meaning that train sets would not be permanently coupled, rather using sets of 2 semi-permanently coupled cars and single cars. Additionally, the Midwest would be receiving dedicated cafe cars and combination economy and business class cars. On top of that, in 2019, the state of Wisconsin added 9 cars to the order, adding 6 coaches and 3 coach cab cars for the Hiawatha service, most likely also using the SC44 style cab design. Deliveries were planned to take place between 2020 and 2023, and just as expected, in 2020, the first car was delivered to Amtrak, beginning high-speed testing on the Northeast Corridor soon after. Soon enough, cars began to be delivered to both Northern California and the Midwest, and testing began there too. Unfortunately, as the testing process continued, a pretty alarming issue came to light, that being the fact that trace amounts of lead were found in the water treatment systems of these cars, which were manufactured by a different subcontractor than those of Brightline. Anyways, this issue brought the project to a halt, delaying their debut into regular service, as Siemens Mobility worked to fix the issues. New water management systems were retrofitted onto the existing cars, allowing for testing to start again in mid to late 2021, and by the end of the year, Venture cars are ready to enter service. Amtrak Midwest Ventures made their in-service debut on February 1st, 2022, when they were seen on Amtrak Lincoln Service Train number 303. As you can see from this footage of their debut, the train was unfortunately not all Venture cars, but it was close enough as the cafe cars haven't been delivered yet, so 1 AM fleet is necessary to provide food to passengers. As of when this video is being completed, Venture cars are slowly being entered into service in the Midwest at a rate of 8 cars per month, and Venture cars in California haven't entered service quite yet, but they should be very soon. Production of the remaining cars in this order is ongoing at Siemens, with cab cars and cafe cars beginning production as of when this video is being uploaded. Despite the setbacks in these cars entering service, the actual production and delivery of these Venture cars hasn't really been delayed that much, which is definitely very good for Amtrak. Between now and late 2023, all 146 of these cars should be delivered, greatly improving service for passengers in Northern California and the Midwest. But remember at the beginning of this part of the video where I said that Siemens Venture cars would replace old equipment on over half of Amtrak's routes? Well, Amtrak Midwest and the San Joaquins are obviously much less than half of Amtrak's routes. So what about basically every other route? Well, that's where Amtrak's massive $7.3 billion order with Siemens Mobility comes in. In July of 2021, Amtrak announced that it had made a deal with Siemens Mobility to build a replacement for all Amfleet 1 cars across the system, which are the backbone of Amtrak's fleet in the Northeast on some of their most vital routes. In an article written by Amtrak, a plan was laid out for the acquisition of 83 Siemens Venture intercity train sets, with options for an additional 130 trains should Amtrak want to expand service further. Now, let's go into further detail. This project will be split into 3 phases, all of which will work to improve intercity routes in specific regions. This first phase, which is also the shortest, will be the replacement of the aging train sets on Amtrak's Cascades route, which will use Siemens Venture cars similar to those seen in Northern California and the Midwest. Between 2024 and 2025, 8 6-car train sets will be delivered, consisting of 5 coaches and 1 cab car, which will most likely have an SC44 style cab to match the existing SC44 locomotives currently used on this route. This phase of the 83 train set order will be the only one that doesn't include locomotives, just being a relatively basic order of cars and cab cars. Additionally, this phase is the only one where the specific amount of cars on order has been confirmed. Although phase 1 doesn't really sound that groundbreaking, the next phase certainly is. Phase 2, by far the biggest and most impactful phase, will be the replacement of all equipment used on the Northeast Regional, Palmetto, Carolinian, Downeaster, Keystone, Hartford Line, Valley Flyer, Pennsylvanian, and Vermonter routes. Now, if you're very observant, you may notice that almost all of these routes are partially electrified and partially diesel powered. So how does Amtrak plan to use the same equipment on both types of routes? It's simple really. This part of the order will include dual-mode locomotives capable of using both diesel and electric power, allowing for seamless power changes in places where electrification ends and begins, such as Washington, D.C. For this part of the order, Siemens will be building 58 Venture train sets, but in addition to the standard cars and cab cars, they'll also be building a fleet of dual-mode locomotives. This new type of locomotive will be known as the ALC-42E, and will be similar to the existing diesel-only ALC-42, while being capable of switching between diesel and overhead electricity, drawing power from a trailing Venture car with a pantograph. This part of the order will take place between 2025 and 2029, and unfortunately, At this point in time, we have no formal renderings of these cars, but what we do know is that these train sets will consist of an ALC-42E, a varying number of Siemens Venture cars, and an ALC-42 styled Siemens Venture cab car. Most surprisingly, these dual-mode ALC-42Es will replace most Siemens ACS-64 locomotives, which will be rendered obsolete by dual-mode trains. The only purpose the ACS-64s will serve is pulling select long-distance trains between New York and Washington and serving as spare locomotives, so Amtrak will most likely sell off most of their ACS-64s to local commuter rails midway through their life, as only a handful of sprinters will be needed for these routes. Finally, the third and possibly the most ambitious phase is the replacement of all equipment used on the Empire Service, Ethan Allen Express, Maple Leaf, and Adirondack routes. Between 2029 and 2030, 17 train sets will be delivered using the same Siemens Venture cars but no cab cars. Much like Phase 2, this portion of the order will replace aging Amfleet 1s, but that's where the similarities end. Instead of using dual-mode locomotives that use overhead electricity, these locomotives will be able to hook up to auxiliary trailer cars, which will use Amtrak's first ever battery power system as opposed to overhead electricity. With this said, as far as I know, they'll still be classified as ALC-42Es. Additionally, much like the P32 ACDMs they'll replace, these locomotives will have third rail shoes, making it possible to tap into third rail electricity on the Empire Corridor between New York City and Croton-Harmon. In short, this $7.3 billion contract between Siemens and Amtrak will replace Talgo train sets on the Cascades, Amfleet 1s and Metroliner cab cars as a whole, most electric-only ACS-64 locomotives, and all P32 ACDM dual-mode locomotives between 2024 and 2030. Of course, as of right now, we don't know many specific details, but as the development process continues for these train sets, more details will be revealed. According to a recent Amtrak presentation, the final design for these cars is due on October 17th, 2023, so between then and now, we should see some concept art for these trains. Supposedly, after October of 2023, the construction of these trains will begin, and the following year, delivery will begin. In conclusion, the Siemens acquisitions have been a breath of fresh air for Amtrak fans, as instead of the usual constant delays seen on projects such as the Viewliner 2 project, the cancelled NextGen Bi-Level project, and of course the Acela 2 project, Siemens seems to be good at building quality rail equipment in a timely manner, and Amtrak knows this, hence why by 2030, the majority of their fleet will be built by Siemens, which is quickly becoming one of the biggest names in American passenger rail. Chapter 4. What else are we missing? Now, these past two projects I've talked about will replace the majority of Amtrak's outdated equipment system-wide, such as the original Acela train sets, Horizon cars, and Amfleet 1 cars, and of course the iconic P42 diesel locomotives. So what else is missing? For the most part, surprisingly not much, but I did manage to find one route that desperately needs some attention, and that route is the Piedmont. Amtrak's Piedmont service is one of their most overlooked services, and as a state-supported corridor route in North Carolina, it makes sense why. Unfortunately, due to low ridership numbers and in turn, not enough funding, the Piedmont still uses cars built in the 50s and 60s. Its locomotives are not much better, being EMD F59PH and F59PHI locomotives, which have been retired everywhere else except for in Northern California, where they received heavy-duty overhauls in order to conform to EPA Tier 2 emission standards. As of right now, there's no planned replacement for the Piedmont equipment, but that doesn't mean that it'll stay that way forever. This is just speculation, but since the Piedmont is a corridor route, it'll most likely get equipment similar to that of Amtrak Midwest or Amtrak California, that being Siemens Chargers and Venture cars. Remember when I mentioned that Amtrak ordered 83 train sets, but they had the option to order 130 more? Well, if they decide to order any more trains from Siemens, perhaps some could be for North Carolina. If they do end up doing this, I would expect them to order 3 or 4 trains consisting of 1 SC44 Charger locomotive, 4 Siemens Venture cars, and 1 SC44 styled Venture cab car. Of course, this is just speculation on my part, but it could and certainly should happen in the near future. Aside from that, there really aren't many other pieces of equipment that are super old on Amtrak, with exception of the Viewliners, which are quite old, although they should have a few more years left in service since they're being refurbished right now. Another bit of speculation though is that Amtrak will begin the process of repainting most of their equipment to Phase 7 paint to match their new Siemens ALC-42s. I theorize that over the next few years, we'll start to see ACS-64s, Superliners, Amfleet 2s, and perhaps even a few P42s being painted into this new paint scheme. Finally, the last bit of speculation I want to throw in here has to do with what will happen to Amtrak's P42 locomotives after they're retired in favor of Siemens ALC-42s. When they were originally ordered, many speculated that after all ALC-42s were entered into service, P-42s would be gutted and turned into non-powered control units similar to what Amtrak did when the F-40s were retired many years ago. Despite the fact that it would definitely make sense for Amtrak to replace the aging F-40 NPCUs with P-42s, I doubt this will happen for two reasons. The main reason why I think Amtrak won't turn their P-42s into NPCUs is simply that they have new cab cars on order with Siemens. NPCUs essentially serve the same purpose as cab cars, short of the fact that they hold baggage instead of passengers. But in this current day and age, the use of a baggage car is fleeting. Anyways, the F-40 NPCUs will definitely be retired once Venture cab cars enter service, but that won't be for a few years. What if the P-42s are rebuilt into NPCUs just to be used for the next 5 to 10 years? Well, the reason why this won't happen is that the P-42s are built from one singular locomotive shell as opposed to multiple parts, so if a sliding baggage door was added on the side of a P-42, it would greatly reduce its structural rigidity. Aside from that, Amtrak is actually in the process of making more NPCUs, but instead of being based on F-40s this time, they'll be based on HHP electric locomotives. As of right now, the locomotives are in the process of being designed as cab cars, but in a year or so, a select number of de-electrified HHP-8s will supplement aging F-40 NPCUs in service. Other than that, there really isn't a whole lot of equipment that'll need to be replaced in the coming years, as Amtrak's many orders with Siemens Mobility cover a pretty big percentage of Amtrak routes. Right now, it seems hard to believe that over the course of the next 10 years, the majority of Amtrak's fleet will be replaced with brand new Siemens equipment, but if all goes according to the plan, that'll be the first time ever where Amtrak has a modern fleet, which is crazy to think of as a rail fan. Chapter 5. Conclusion. After years of using the same equipment, Amtrak has finally received the funding for its biggest fleet rejuvenation ever, replacing aging equipment on almost all routes across its system. Right now, it's hard to believe, but in less than 10 years, Amtrak's trains will look completely different using environmentally friendly trains built for the 21st century. Of course, 10 years is a long time, and this will be a long process, but it'll be very cool to see how much America's railroad will change in that time, and I'll make sure to continue to provide updates as the process goes on. This has been an episode of American High Speed Rail Week 2 presented by Worldwide Railfan. If you're watching this when it's new, stay tuned for tomorrow's episode, but if you're watching this after it's been uploaded, then click on the end cards to see the previous and preceding videos of this series. Additionally, if you want to see more content like this in the future, do consider subscribing, as these videos take a lot of work to make, and your support is always appreciated. With that said, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon in another episode.